Okay, so we are now broadcasting to all attendees, the Monetize Your Business panel. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Engel from Alice. We have a chat on the right-hand side. If you want to answer any questions that we pose to the group, that would be the great spot to do that. And also just let us know if you're having any difficulty hearing, that you can see everything. And also there's a Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. That's where we will be collecting questions for the end of the session. And in a moment here, I will introduce everybody, but I'm going to look at the chat briefly just to make sure that you, the attendees, can hear us and see us. It looks like I'm getting the yeses. Okay, great. So quick introductions. We have on the phone, we have our moderator, Meredith Finn, and she comes from Salesforce Ventures. She's a senior director, and she's focused on investing in impact and enterprise technology companies. So she's led over 40 investments on behalf of Salesforce.com, actually my former employer years and years ago. And before joining there, she actually worked at finance at Twitter and Google, and technology and media investment banker at Evercore. So she has a ton of technology and investment experience. So she'll be enlightening to lead this group in this conversation. Abe Kara, based here in Dallas with me, is a director of business development at Mark Cuban Companies. So he leads all the Shark Tank and CPG companies at Mark Cuban, the whole portfolio, really managing the operations, e-commerce, sales, and marketing services, and the direction leading these companies' growth. Lauren is a great friend of Alice, and she's a lifelong tech entrepreneur. So her early stage investor and strategic investor, and she also is the managing partner of Belle Capital. So this fund is comprised of women investors investing in actually women-led tech firms. She's also the founder and CEO of SCIO Corp, a strategic advisory company. So she has invested in also 40 early stage tech companies to date, which is really exciting. Kate, based out of DC, Kate Goodall is the CEO of Halcyon, really the driving strategic force behind it, leading the team of innovators focused on solving 21st century problems, really going to lend a lot of great instrumental advice. She has developed the Halcyon Incubator for social enterprises and leads that currently out of DC. So you'll see me fade into the background. I'm going to let everybody have the stage here, and we're really excited. So answer or ask your questions in the Q&A, and let us know if you can't hear us.
Great. Thanks so much for that fabulous introduction. We were, I think, all disappointed on this panel that this couldn't happen in person in DC back at the beginning of the month due to a windstorm, which was a first, I think, for all of us. But we are so happy that we are able to join you all online today, and really excited for you to hear from this panel that has just such fantastic experience to share with the audience. So let's sort of kick it off. I'm going to sort of address a question to each of you so that you have a chance to share your experiences in particular. And then, we'll dive into a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience for questions. But Abe, let's start with you. You've helped over 100 portfolio companies across sort of the Shark Tank ecosystem and Mark Cuban's companies. What are the insights you can share with the audience on the best early stage strategies on how to generate revenue and be lean?
Well, thanks, and good to be here with everyone. It varies on the industries, but in today's world, you really need to have an online strategy and very well defined. So let's say you're a consumer product. It's very important we do this for Shark Tank companies, for example. So before the airing of a show, we make sure that the brands have the right online presence. When you have a lot of traffic on a Shark Tank airing, the websites used to crash. So if a website crashes, you're losing a lot of sales and potential new contacts and partnerships. So it's important to have the right online presence and the online strategy. And that extends to beyond the website. So what does that mean? Could be, if you're a consumer product, does that mean having the right presence on Amazon? And what's your Amazon strategy? You can't just list the product on Amazon. You need a strategy, right? And strategy is not just about what kind of products, but your pricing strategy as well. How does your price on Amazon compare to your website, compared to your brick and mortars, if you're talking brick and mortar again? So I'm going to be using, I think most of my example will be more on the consumer product side, because we have the majority of our Shark Tank brands are more consumer product. But it also applies on the technology. I mean, what is your strategy for engaging with your customers online? And that has to be clearly defined before you start anything.
Yeah, no, I think that's just such fabulous advice. Sometimes entrepreneurs I've found get so focused on building the product that thinking about whether it's monetization or customer service, sort of falls secondary. But those are really sort of key points to, establishing a great foundation for a business. Lauren, you have an incredibly interesting perspective as both an investor and a lifelong entrepreneur. You've also really sort of spent your career helping to accelerate the ecosystem for both female investors and female-led technology companies. Specifically at Belle Capital, you're very focused on backing promising tech companies owned or led by women, and you've really made it your mission to change the ratio and change the makeup of this industry, which is personally a passion for me as well. So a lot of alignment there, and I'm sure everybody that's joining in and listening is super passionate and aligned with the work that you're doing as well. And it would be great to sort of get your perspective on how specifically you've coached female founders through their unique growth stages on their path to monetization. Any tips that you can sort of specifically share that you think would be relevant in particular to trends you've seen across female founders?
Great, thanks. And again, glad to be here and really excited to be supporting Alice, which is one of our investments. So Belle is a proud investor. So typically, Belle invests in companies that already have some revenue or very near-term revenue, or we have one company we've invested in, which is a life science company that's got a treatment for atrial fibrillation, and they plan to exit pre-revenue, but they already had engagement with strategic partners who would be potential go-to-market partners or acquirers. So we want to know that companies have revenues. And then the key question is, what's the business model that can accelerate those revenues and they can scale? And a lot of times what a company will start with in their initial business model isn't really the one that's going to take them or scale them. I often get asked though by the companies, hey, we don't have revenues yet, so you can't look at us. What do we have to do? Because it's sort of that, catch-21. And so a lot of things that I advise people are what I used to do myself. I'm a former software entrepreneur. And one of the ways that I would start out initially, and it's a very low capital, lean model, is, I would find a problem I wanted to solve, and we would get a customer who would fund the first implementation. So they would pay for custom development, and usually in milestones, so you didn't even have to raise capital. And concurrently, we would pay our developers on the same milestones, so they didn't get salaries for not doing work. So we would align the payment to the expense ratio, and there you'd get a first implementation. It might not even be fully a minimum viable product, but it would be something that you could showcase and get customer feedback and really turn into a software solution. I had one of the first software as a service companies. We didn't call it that then. It was an ASP shared model, but in the early days, it was really important to iterate, get something out there, iterate quickly, till you finally have that critical feature set that really solves the problem that for the niche that you're aimed at, and then to work on the model that creates scale. So that's a really underused technique, which is customer financing, employee and vendor financing. And if you can put those pieces together, you actually need virtually no capital, your human capital, your brain power to do it. But that's always going to attract an investor or partners or even great people, is the fact that you have customers. Or even if you don't fully have a customer yet, you may find somebody who will pay to do a pilot, or who will do a beta test that if you reach XYZ parameters for them and they're happy, they'll buy product from you, or they'll prepay. So there's a lot of ways to do it. Depends on what industry you are. Of course, it's very different in consumer products versus software products or medical products. And I'm in all of those different kinds of companies. So there's different ways to do it. But the thing that's in common is to get, as quickly as you can, the fundamental version of the solution to the problem, and to get customer feedback and iterate, and then develop your business model to scale.
Yeah. And I love that model myself, of really finding that first customer who's also sort of a partner with you in the development, right? There's sort of no better person to work with than a customer who's willing to sort of iterate with you and share exactly what their needs are. It helps ensure, I think, that you're not building sometimes just within a vacuum, but rather really building out a product and features that customers want to buy, right? And I think you understand, the customer needs in a completely different way. And it's certainly, I think, an innovative model to both get some revenue in the door and some cash in the door, and show some customer traction, while also starting to finance the business initially. So I think truly some great advice. Kate, we'll turn to you now. At Halcyon, you're running an incubator, so you're probably seeing companies, from potentially even just an idea. How do you help founders at the earliest stages really think about how to take their ideas and turn them into businesses with scalable revenue? What's sort of some of the earliest advice you're finding that you're giving entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so at Halcyon, we actually only take early stage entrepreneurs, and the way that we define that is sort of idea, pilot, MVP, no later. Within that, even that small space, you've got a vast range, so I'm happy to talk sort of from a practical perspective, perhaps some examples of how I've seen people handle this, because people do it in different ways and it certainly depends on whether you're planning to bootstrap and just build revenue, or if you're going to be pursuing funding. And we've seen both work. And the biggest mistake I see people make, I think, is, really not concentrating on whether or not they've got a great product. Right. So, lots of people come to us and say, I've got this idea. How do I monetize? And usually, we start by taking a step back and saying, well, what's the product? How do you know that people are going to buy it? How do you know that it's valuable? And often, just by asking that question, then you get around to some areas that they haven't maybe thought through really strategically. Even if they have done the surveys of people to find out, about potential price points and things like that, have they stripped back who they've asked? Are they more than one step removed? Are they getting really objective feedback? Have they questioned whether or not these people actually buy these types of products, whether or not they have the purchasing power? Are they a real customer, a potential customer? We have definitely seen the sort of like the pilot for cheap model, Lauren, to follow on from what you're saying. And that's, I think I agree, that's like one of the best ways to do it. And obviously sort of taking into account that you're going to be making mistakes. So give that first partner a break. And another way that, this is a bit of a random one that we saw people use, but a great example of how you can really think outside the box. We have people doing social enterprises, so while they're working on their sort of, their revenue and their profit metric, they're also working on like an impact metric. So they're, thinking about coral reefs or wellness in hospitals or, all of those kinds of things. So they've almost got that double problem. And one of the ways that a couple of our ventures used to give themselves that space in that lean startup moment was to just create a totally new product. It was not the product that they were planning on selling or monetizing ultimately. In fact, it was a political version of Cards Against Humanity that they put out on Amazon and just made a quick like 50 grand. And they were imaginative enough and resourceful enough to do that and do that well. And that gave them enough padding. But, you know, you don't have to sell yourself too early to investors before you even know if you've got something viable. If you can be imaginative about it and build yourself that space.
Definitely. I think some really interesting advice, and it's always, I think at the earliest stages, the more creative you can get with regard to, you know, bringing in capital through the door without necessarily having to talk to VCs, and this is coming from a VC, it actually behooves you. So I think, you know, working with customers, just sort of getting a product out there and some early cash in the door, through some of those creative mechanisms makes sense.
Well, and then you'll be
one more thing. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say one other technique for consumer products and mainly is crowdfunding. So, for example, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and we see that a lot where before they even put the product on the market, they create a crowdfunding campaign just to validate the product. So if they can cover their minimum expense to make the product based on the complexity of it, you know, just the cost of just the molds or an initial minimum order that they need to finance, and the engagement they get from the customers in that 30, 45 days of the crowdfunding really defines what the product success is going to look like. And in many cases, they get feedback from their customers during that crowdfunding campaign on how to improve and modify the product when they actually deliver it. So from features to colors to flavors, you name it. And we've seen a lot of success with doing a crowdfunding because it's pretty much your only cost is a really good video and just knowing how to put together a crowdfunding, a Kickstarter, and Indiegogo page. And the rest is just figuring out how to engage with your customers and building momentum. And we've seen, some real great success with some of our brands in whenever they want to introduce a new product, a new concept, they crowdfund it, they test it, they validate it, and then they go big with it.
Yeah. And do you think that crowdfunding, and this is sort of a question to everyone, because obviously there's been an emergence of various crowdfunding platforms as, you know, government regulation has changed to enable more people to participate in funding sort of startups. I think or I guess my perspective and bias is, but I open this question up to everyone, is I think it works particularly well for consumer companies where you're sort of selling that first version of the product. Sort of curious if you guys have seen any other businesses or business types where, you know, maybe it's beyond, hardware or a tangible retail product where you've seen crowdfunding work, or any thoughts on crowdfunding in general?
Not as prevalent in software and tech and life sciences, you know, just those are kind of harder things. I mean, I think it's very good for a consumer, but there's, you know, you can get partner funding, as I mentioned. So we talked about customer funding and vendor funding. There's also partners that can help get you additional funding or some kind of project financing. So for example, we're actually looking at a company now that has a kind of Internet of Things platform, and they were able to get a customer who said, if you can meet this set of specifications, I'm going to give you $1 million order. And then based on that sort of standby order for a product set, they were able to get some angel investors come in and, you know, fund the first version of it to do that. And that can work really well. And another one of our companies makes disinfecting lights, Vital Bio, very exciting company. And they have a patent on a single diode. So that's a hard thing. Like, how are you going to get those to, for example, as I'm pushing Abe here to the Mark Cuban's Mavericks, you know, locker room. But how are you going to get that out there? So they've got go-to-market partners that are actually putting them in light fixtures, like top lighting companies. And they have some that are selling to hospitals and ambulances. So they found these different partners that can take that tech and fully productize it. And then again, you know, that becomes like, it's almost like a crowdfunding in the sense that you get enough of these partners, they're kind of driving some of the direction that the end product will be, so that it's a more complete solution. And that can be a very powerful way to get financing, both from those partners and then from investors who will back you, because it's a go-to-market strategy. Now you have either licensees or partners or distributors, and they're going to take, your piece of the puzzle, add it to theirs, and have a value-added solution. So that's sort of the non-crowdfunding way to do a similar approach.
I think there's also like a right stage to do it, right? I mean, you mentioned certain products where it doesn't work because of, you're still working out IP and things like that. But you also don't want to do it too early. You do still want to have that sort of minimum viable product first, because I think the most effective way I've seen it used is when that is already in place and you're seeking a little bit of tide over funding just to get you to the next level, or to make the next test. A good example is one of our ventures that they're called Uptop Acres, and they're essentially converting all of the roof space in DC to farmland. Their vision is you fly over DC and you just see green, right? And it's a brilliant concept. And they just opened a new farm, and they just needed, that little extra boost to be able to deal with stormwater issues on that new roof or something. And it was perfect for them to be like that bridge. But it's not, I think you have to, it's not like a panacea. You have to think about when to use it, when you're ready to use it. And you have, like to Abe's point, you have to have a clearly defined strategy. You can't just jump into a crowdfunding campaign. Like with any campaign, you really want to have about half of it done before you go public.
I agree, Kate. We've seen, and it's evolved, it's like on the consumer side, we've seen success with companies that already have established products in the market. And what they do is every new product they launch, now they use that as a channel. So we have a company called Power Practical, and they're an outdoor lighting company. They have anything from flashlights to light strips, and they were in brick and mortar, and then they've been through the struggle of just the brick and mortar space, and they decided to switch everything 100% online. And so they went to .com and Amazon, and what they do now is every time they have a new product, or iteration of the product, they push it on crowdfunding sites, and then they take it from there straight back to their website. So to your point, it's a product that it's not just an idea, and over time you become experts at it, and you have to know there's a strategy in place. You can't just put up a page and post a tweet and expect people to buy your product.
Yeah, definitely.
Even with IP products, sometimes you can have a dual strategy. So we're in a consumer goods / medical device product. So it's for women for pelvic wellness. And ultimately the FDA regulated version will be for incontinence. And so that's a longer cycle to get those kind of products to market. And those are the kind of companies that really have a challenge. Like they have to raise a lot of money, and you can't sell it till you have approval, so that's tough. So they came out with a consumer version that they're able to, get sold through to doctors and to thought leaders to recommend it. And that's starting to really take off through distributor channels. So that's going to become a very successful consumer product for them, driving lots of revenue while they're, sort of staging through the process of approval, regulatory approval, to get their medical device to market, which is where we hope it really takes off. But this dual strategy, it's hard to do because it can be defocusing in a way and take more total capital. But at the same time, it can get a product to market quickly and get revenues coming in, like your example, Kate, of the $50K for the political version against Cards Against Humanity. It gets cash flow in to give you the padding to do some of the other things you need. So sometimes a dual product strategy can make sense.
Yeah, agreed. I guess where have you guys, shifting the conversation slightly to where you've seen people make mistakes, where have founders struggled the most when it comes to thinking about sort of converting something from, an idea to a product, to then really thinking about monetization? What are sort of the missteps that our audience can hopefully look to avoid?
We're going to need longer than an hour.
Yeah. as concise as you can possibly be. You know, we've seen on our side, right, from our portfolio, that you know, sometimes people are going after the wrong customer base immediately, or have underestimated the sales cycle length of selling into enterprise, and so, you know, have needed to sort of pivot their strategy a little bit to focus maybe more, rather than going after the Fortune 500, right? Does this product sort of meet the needs of companies sort of more in the medium-sized business range, right? And then sort of look to scale into the enterprise over time. You know, so it's been interesting because at least from a B2B SaaS perspective, I think everyone's goal is ultimately to sell into the enterprise. Sometimes starting there, though, is incredibly hard. And you know, thinking that you're going to go around and sort of talk to the buyer at each of those large enterprise companies and close the deal in 90 days is massively unrealistic. So, you know, are there any sort of, you know, based on your experiences, any sort of examples like that where you know, people may be selling to the wrong customer, they may struggle with marketing, you know, how they may struggle with sort of pricing on a product. We've seen that as a big issue. Any advice that you guys have, or common missteps you've seen people make?
I think the tightrope that, like, we see people walk, you know, where sometimes they'll fall too much on one side or the other, is either sort of, you know, not really getting that core product right before you scale, you know, not having that good feedback loop that you're kind of referring to in terms of, you know, have you asked yourself the right questions? Have you tested this in the right way before you go big? You know, people sometimes fall too much on that side. And then on the other side, people have got it right, and they're just not, they still don't leap, right? They don't go big at the right time, or they're still stuck in that testing and that feedback loop phase when they should have perhaps, you know, been thinking bigger. You know, I think people do need to understand that you are going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Just try to keep the impact of the mistakes to a minimum, and go for it when you once you find that fit.
Definitely.
I agree. And you know, it's about cash flow. I think managing cash flow and running the business as a business, understanding that there are expenses, there are budgets. It's every product, every customer has a timeline, and just having realistic expectations. Because, you know, the game changer is really cash. You know, if you run out of cash, it's game over. And if you get more cash, you get to survive for another 6 months or a year. So it's really about understanding the impact of cash flow to your business on a day-to-day basis.
And getting to break even as quickly as you can, because then you have a lot more options for going forward or pivoting without having to always raise capital. We see a lot of companies just really underestimate how much capital they need, and not really being able to get into full profitability because they don't dig in deeply enough into their financial model to really understand the profitability drivers and the things that can drive scale, you know, the economies of scale. And so, for example, when you try to sell consumer, a lot of times people don't realize how expensive it is to sell a consumer product, or they underestimate in enterprise how long that sales cycle is and how many of them you have to have. So often you can find these little niches in vertical market or medium size where you're not going against the big competitors. You might be able to get a toehold. And at the same time, if you go to create a new market, that can take a really long time because you're just educating. So you have to really find for whom is your solution which problem is your solution perfect for, and which niche that can be the most addressable first market. And to your point, Kate, that may not be the scaling market, but it can get you out and get you a toehold. And that's really the challenge. You know, with your cash, who can I sell to fast? Who's going to buy this? And use that as the foundation then to grow the business.
Yeah. Do you guys have any advice on pricing too? So this is like typically for us, the number one question almost across the board that our portfolio companies are asking us, and obviously is critically important to thinking about monetization, right? Is you need to sort of understand your customer's willingness and ability to pay for the product, but then also make sure that you're pricing the product in a way that has the potential to be profitable long-term, sort of as you're talking about, Lauren. Any advice for companies at the earliest stages on how to think about pricing, or how you guys have advised them to think about pricing? And we've certainly seen in our portfolio pricing evolves over time, how people are sort of shifting their pricing models over time as well.
Well, one thing we look at is, their business model, because, it is going to evolve over time. So what you're looking at initially is how sophisticated is your thinking? Are you looking at all the bites at the apple, right? The full distribution chain, all the people that have to have enough money in it for it to be worth their while to be a partner with you to go to market. And then ultimately, what does it cost you to deliver or make that product or service? And can you make a profit? So really understanding the entire value chain and all the players in it and what drives profitability, and at what point, can scale get you economies on pricing or service. That's probably the most fundamental thing, is understanding that. Whether the customer is going to pay for that, be willing to pay for it or not, is, big question that you only know by having it in the market. But you're not going to make money as a business if you haven't priced in every aspect of the value chain.
Right. And if you're not making money, then it's not a business, right?
Business, right.
An important distinction. Because you can even sort of sell products, but you can be selling every single product at a loss. And so, I think an important thing for every entrepreneur to keep in mind, and any advice that you guys are sharing with your portfolio companies in particular around this point, I think would be really valuable for the audience. But, selling each unit profitably, it should be your long-term goal, and something that I think everybody's keeping their eye on. So, any sort of specific examples you guys have there, or companies that
for consumer, for example, the easiest way just to figure out how to price your product is just look at your competitors. And what you can do is, can you provide a product that is at a lower cost? And if you can't, based on the margins that you have in your specific product, can you offer a higher cost, and can you just justify the value? Can you sell it at a higher cost because of the added features, the added values of what you're providing as a product or a service? And if you can figure that out, and it's just pretty much math, right? You just have to figure out the margins, and what margin is that? And is that acceptable for your business to scale? And can it actually go down with scale as well? So you have to figure all that out early on. The other thing specifically for consumer is, back to what we were saying, define your strategy, your online strategy. And are you going to be 100% online, direct to consumer, or are you going to be open for more brick and mortar distribution? Because that will define what your margin is and what your range that is acceptable. So, for example, if you're selling a product at a store, you have to consider the margins that you would have to give to the person who's reselling your product to store. And you have to consider, let's say, if you're using a sales rep to get you that product into a store, versus if you're just selling online, you don't have the middleman, you don't have a storefront that needs 50%, let's say, margin. But you do have to consider, digital marketing expenses in order to connect to your consumer, right? What's your cost per acquisition? So it varies, and you have to figure out all of these metrics early on before you make mistakes. Because the last thing you want to do is, let's say, get a big purchase order from Walmart and you can't meet their margin requirements because every PO they give you, you're losing money, right?
Right.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. So we'll do a couple more questions here on our end before we open it up to the audience. So again, to the audience, feel free to continue to post your questions, and we'll get to them shortly. For companies that you guys have seen sort of pivot, when and how should companies think about pivoting, right? If they're struggling with monetization? Is that the cue to pivot in a different direction? How have you sort of advised companies that have gone through a pivot to think about that?
I think, first of all, and I'm sure that Lauren and Abel agree, and you too, Meredith, like, it's very rare that like the very first idea that you have is actually what you end up doing without at least minor iteration. And that comes out of this sort of what we've been sort of talking about this whole time in terms of knowing your customer. And the existential part of that is knowing yourself, right? And that's the part where you have to face your demons as an entrepreneur and really, really question yourself. Like, I thought this was a good idea, but is it proving out? And that willingness to do that and then to pivot as needed is so essential, along with that, essential resilience that we all know we see in the most successful entrepreneurs. In terms of a good example, we worked with Girl and this really amazing special entrepreneur, Deanna Sierra, who's working in the developing world to provide undergarments to girls who don't, have readily accessible products. But she is doing it, for a profit. And I went from an initial idea that was a really well-designed menstrual pad to something that had something built into the underwear, after discovering that many girls didn't even have underwear. So, again, it was part of that learning about your customer, truly understanding their needs, and then matching it with the business model. And that's, probably one of the easiest to understand examples, but I don't think there's a single entrepreneur that we have seen that hasn't made some tweak, right?
Yeah, usually it happens when the need to pivot is when you don't meet your sales forecast, right? So you don't have the cash, and your investors or your board is saying, what the heck's going on? One of our investments started out great. It's a company called Dixite, and they do digital market research. And they thought they were going to sell more through agencies. And that started to do great. And then the agencies would use it with their end customers. And it took off, but then it kind of was not growing at the same speed. So then they came up with the notion of doing sprints, which is like a little short version that you can do a very low cost, quick test of it. And then they found that that was enough that the companies themselves were ordering it directly, because it was low enough they could just put it on a credit card. It was, they could do a sprint for under 10,000 to do a test of a product as a sort of test, if you will, before going online to find a $100,000 a year SaaS deal, right? So by coming up with these little under the radar mini implementations, it wasn't really a different product. It was a different way of pricing and bringing it to market. And suddenly sales went boom. And they opened up to a whole new level of potential customers. And so they went away from thinking, okay, the agency's our channel, to we can still do that, but we can go direct. And to shorten that enterprise sales cycle, we can make it easy enough that just a product manager put on a credit card to try out, because now I've got real-time digital marketing in an iterative feedback loop. So that's a case where, just being more creative on pricing and process made a difference, a rapid difference in scale. But it usually happens when, your forecast isn't working. You don't usually pivot if everything's going right?
So true. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Abe, any last thoughts on pivoting from your perspective, or we can dive into our audience questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have another example. We have a company we invested in called Lollyware. They do edible cups, so they call it biodegradable, and it's two women founders. They started out, the challenge they had was the cups that they were making in small batches were great, but when they started scaling, there were a lot of challenges with scaling it, in scaling production, and the costs that they expected early on did not match the projection of scaling because of the complexity and the waste. So that was not a viable model, even though it's a consumer product. Usually it's the reverse. When you scale a consumer product, the price goes down manufacturing wise. This one had so many challenges that they have to figure out another version of the product. And they started thinking, well, what else can we do? Where is a product needing alternatives for plastic, and they looked everywhere, and they found the straw. There's lots of plastic straws in the market, and no one has found an alternative for plastic or paper straws. And so now they use their same biodegradable material, which is almost like it's a seaweed gelatin. It's a straw that you can eat, and it's biodegradable, and that replaces plastic. So they've pivoted in terms of the product because of challenges with manufacturing the original product. It had nothing to do with the consumer or their market. The market was there. They just couldn't get the product at the price point and scale it the way they originally planned.
Yeah, super interesting that the problem isn't always on the market being there or the monetization side, right? But on the actual production. And you'll see that in software too, where, maybe the V1 you built can't scale with the demand that you're seeing, and you need to sort of go think about rebuilding the platform. It happens in software as well. Well, that was great. Let's turn to some of our audience questions. And I don't have who these are from, so I can't credit the author. But we'll start with a question about mobile apps and thinking about monetization, moving from a freemium model to a paid model. So the question is, what are your recommendations on how to successfully create the path to monetization from freemium to paid features in a mobile app? Anything to avoid? Is there a threshold of users before doing this?
Is a question too?
It's not addressed to anyone. I think it's just sort of broadly to the audience. If anyone sort of has experience in sort of taking, and I think really it's probably applicable not only to mobile apps and thinking about that transition from freemium to paid, but any sort of offerings that you've seen where it's a movement from offering a free product to thinking about a paid product.
I would suggest it's not necessarily replacing one for the other. You can always have both. You can have a freemium as an entry point for new customers, and then as you add additional features, have a paid version of the product with increments based on how much additional features and value you're providing.
Yeah, that's what we've seen a lot in the B2B space as well, right? That there's sort of a base level of features. The key thing that I've seen, quite frankly, with regard to this question is understanding what are the features that people would be willing to pay for, right? If you're giving away the whole cow in the sort of free version of the product, and the features that you're asking users to pay for don't actually add any more value or aren't features that customers would be willing to pay for, it's hard to get them to pay and to see that as a monetization path. So I think I think that's just great advice, Abe, and it's really thinking about what are those features that will incentivize the customer to actually pay, or sort of the must-have features of the product that they would be willing to pay for.
Well, and if you're going to have the dual model, then thinking about how to monetize the free version as well. Obviously, people are very used to ads if you've got the free one, things like that. So, but obviously that's going to take away some focus. So you've got to think carefully about, how you unroll that.
Definitely.
Yeah, and also the branding. I was really interested at Web Summit. I got to hear one of the execs at Candy Crush, and how they built an entire ecosystem of merchandise that they sell and toys. And I mean, it's unbelievable what happened out of that. But they really took an approach, almost Disney, to, these are characters, and people start identifying with these characters in this game or this app. And now, we're going to actually personalize them, and we can have merchandising. So I think it depends on if it's a gamification or, what type of app it is. But if it's a kind of a game or more consumer things like that, there may be ancillary merchandise that you can sell that'll be additional streams of revenue.
Got it. Great. This next question is probably a little bit more about how to think about marketing your technology and getting users onto the platform. So any success stories for an early stage company with a product launched and ready? What advice do you have for go-to-market strategies that are one-to-many? We need to get users on our app in order to fund this next phase and have tried advertising and social media without much success. Lauren, this part of the question is addressed specifically to you. And we were first to market marketing technology. Now there are many players. How should we evaluate and adjust strategy based on competitors bubbling up in our space? And if we start to run out of capital, is there a way to do M&A versus investment in a short time frame? A lot captured in that one question.
Yeah, that's
we can definitely think about it, but
well,
I'll let you respond.
Fundamental thing I heard is they can't get users on the app, right? So is it really a product people want? I mean, you know, what need are they filling? I mean, they should be able to get people to get on an app if they've got something that they really need. I mean, I don't know enough about what it is. It's a very theoretical question, but it sounds to me that the fundamental problem is they might not be having something somebody wants. I mean, and if there's a lot of customers and competitors out there who are being successful, what's differentiating? Why would somebody pick their product? I mean, that's actually what you said, Abe, you know, look at the competition and can you make it better and cheaper or better and justify a premium value? So it sounds a little like a disconnect of what they have and what people want, because you should be able to get people on an app if you've got something they want. Social media can be very effective. There are also other ways of just reaching out directly and offering, you know, free versions, a free trial. And one of my companies I'm in, you know, they are in big outreach in a new market. And as part of their sales offering, they're just turning on the app for them for a period of time and populating it with some of the assets that they need to make it work. Because I'm like, my attitude is you're going to take that long to sell to an airlines. So why don't you just put all the airlines assets in it and already make it functional so they're using it from day one and you can already get people on it. You're creating attraction and ability that as you go through the cycle, you'll already have users and inside champions. So, you know, sometimes you could just give it to them and put them on it and make it functional and train them. But if nobody wants to come on it, that's my red flag in that question.
Yeah, agreed. And any thoughts on the M&A piece of the question, which is always an interesting one that we get as well as strategic investors.
Well, you always hope 1 + 1 = 11, or at least 3, but it can be 0 if you're not adding value, right?
Yep. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. If you're not getting users onto the platform, it's pretty tough to think about selling the business. And
one more thing to add, I think if they need to think in terms of partnerships, if possible, based on what their app is. For example, let's say it's a game. They can find a sponsor that they could, you know, create a skin for of one version of the game where that sponsor could push through their customer base. So I think if they could think in terms of partnerships at a higher level and where it makes sense strategically, so you can kind of push through them to their customers versus going direct in the blind. And it depends also on the app and if that applies. But I think thinking outside the box in terms of partnerships might help.
Definitely. Agreed. So an interesting question, moving a little bit away from the pure monetization focus of the platform, but sort of thinking about approaching potential partners who might be interested in also funding the company. So strategic and what we'll call sort of strategic investors, right? Companies that either could be a customer, could be a partner. You know, how do you think about approaching them? What's the right language to use? Yeah, so any advice, and I can jump in and give my perspective too, but any advice from a non-strategic investor perspective for you guys on how you would advise your portfolio companies to think about talking to strategic investors?
Well, I'll take a little of that because I'm a huge proponent of it. I mean, to me, that's a reason I want to invest, because if you have at least a few strategic partners in the game. You've got great resources for go-to-market, and you got potential acquirers at the table. So it's very interesting. But a strategic only engages if there's some aspect of your product or service that's going to be beneficial to their business, either to implement at scale because it's accretive, or because there's a technology there that would be beneficial for them overall. So I really think of it's almost like chess. Like if you wanted world domination, what are the three major or four major steps you'd have to do with really big players that you could dominate the market? A pure monopoly market is like 100% achievement of that, right? So what would be those players that would complement your product or service to create world domination? Okay, then why would they ever want to go with you? What is it that you are giving them that completes, their increased market share in their product or market or business? Or where are they weak or place you can fill? Or why would they want to buy you? Really understanding the answers to those questions, that's how you talk to them. You talk to them about how you complete them, how they complete you, and how together you can create domination in your market, and how you can shore up weaknesses or create innovation for them. And then that's a reason they want to buy you down the line.
Yeah, agreed. Abe and Kate, anything to add to that?
Yeah, a few things. I think it's pretty predictable what questions investors are going to have, and most of the things that we've gone over, right? Like, what is your business model? What's your potential exits? Who are your competitors? What are you doing that's different? And really having solid answers for that, because you've done all of this testing and modifying and finding the best possible version of what you're doing is obviously critical first. And then in my mind, the next step that sometimes people skip, or a couple of steps, is and this is kind of what Lauren was saying, like what's your hit list? Be assertive about who are the investors that you want ideally, and what's your strategy to make those relationships work. And rather than kind of being the person that's going out, particularly when cash flow is short and you're a little bit more desperate, you don't want to be in that position. You want to be in the driver's seat and having ideally form those relationships ahead of time, sometimes as advisors, so that they've seen how you work and have been partners in your thinking, and trust that you can pivot and you're resilient and that you can figure these things out. It's going to be a lot easier, rather than bringing people in at the last minute in a much more transactional way and being on your back foot.
That's actually something Alice is doing very well. So I'll plug Alice here. But Alice has got some corporate sponsors who, want to help see this ecosystem succeed, and who help some of these events. And these are strategic partners who can become affiliates. That means they can begin to make offerings to people of you who are in the audience, who, maybe we can get one set up here with Salesforce, Meredith.
Yeah.
So we have special versions for people who are part of Alice. I mean, why would Salesforce be interested? They want to widen the platform. And if somebody else is doing the sales and marketing and bringing in a new audience, and they don't have to do it, and it's immediately accretive sales, that's a win-win. Alice makes a little money for being the intermediary, and you, the end customer at Alice, gets a deal, right? And gets, experience of peers using it, and so on. So that's an example where, using strategic partners can be value drivers in many ways, and it's good for everybody.
Yeah. Abe, anything to add on your end in terms of companies that you've seen successfully sort of partner or get funding from strategics?
Yeah, I agree with Kate and Lauren. I think it's important to do your research on who you're meeting with, and really be proactive on what the strategic match is between what you're offering as a solution and what is being already in existence within the portfolio of that strategic investor. Because if you can create a match, let's say you provide a solution for one of the portfolio companies, that's kind of one way to get in. And the investor or strategic investor will give you a chance to make the connection. So you can approach it and say, hey, can you please connect me with one of your portfolio companies? We have a solution that would help them out, versus, we're looking for money. So maybe start the conversation earlier, as Kate said, providing value, and then say, hey, by the way, this is the value we provide to one of your portfolio companies, and we are now seeking some strategic investments to grow. Are you interested? and you already have, a business case that shows value.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would say the most compelling people that come to us, so I'm a strategic investor for the audience to clarify, the most compelling people that come to us and ask for money are people that have already demonstrated that through integrating with our products, they've delivered value to a customer, right? And so that's really attractive for us as we're trying to make sure that we're building out an ecosystem of partners that's adding value to our customer base through integrating nicely with our technology, and showing that value really tangibly by having some overlapping customers that you're already working with alongside Salesforce is one of the best ways to convince us from an investment perspective that there's value to us investing and growing this partnership together. So Abe, I think everything that the panel said, but what you said in particular around like demonstrating that value, I think is really important to strategic investors, because unlike financial investors that may be evaluating just what the return is from a financial perspective on an investment, and many strategic investors, not all, but many, are actually also evaluating how this is valuable to the core company as well. Great. There's one more question here on GDPR. So I don't know to the extent that anyone is a GDPR expert on the call, but I want to make sure that we get everyone's questions asked. So the question is around how are you guiding your investments in light of GDPR and the requirements on small business engagement with the EU? So for those on the call that don't know what GDPR is, it's a set of regulations passed in Europe concerning information security primarily, but there's a whole host of things sort of covered by it. And it is very much impacting the way that businesses need to think about operating and in particular data security and information security in Europe. So, and any thoughts there? Have you guys sort of seen companies running into this?
Do we have two companies who's subscribed to that standard? I mean, it's sort of good to already be at the highest, publicly accepted in any significant, measure standard for privacy. And right now the Swiss and EU versions are probably the most comprehensive. I think it's important to stay on top of that. We're all seeing what's going on real time with Facebook here and all these problems. So security is very, very critical, and great to be setting standards or part of standard setting bodies. That's also, by the way, a very good way to get big customers on board if you're part of standard setting bodies and part of self-regulatory bodies in some of these tech areas. Being a contributing member of that can shorten your enterprise sales cycle. That's a tip.
Great. Agreed. So in the last couple minutes for us here, any sort of pages from your playbook or pages from playbooks of successful companies that you've seen, or what's that sort of one sort of secret sauce, secret element of the recipe that you guys would share with the people joining us today?
Domain expertise. If you really want to move your product, make sure you and your founding team and the people you bring in really know it and know that customer, because it's all about customer fit. As Abe said, if you're not making money at it, selling it, it's not a business. And you need the people who've done it and know how to do it. So getting top talent into your team, picking the right founders, spreading those first hires is probably the most critical decision you're going to make that's going to affect the monetization of your product.
So as Mark even says, sales cures all. So you have to be selling at all times as the founder of your company, and everyone at an early stage company, everyone should be selling all the time.
I would say a couple of things. Focus, obviously, like what is that metric that you're seeking to change every week? And maybe it's increasing sales by 5%, but making sure that you're paying attention to something that to keep your focus. Otherwise, you can end up really scattered. Certainly resilience. And then lastly, ask yourself the question, if would you mortgage your house on this, right? Because that's essentially what an investor's going to ask themselves. So you'd better be able to answer yes, absolutely, or even have done it.
Great advice. Well, thank you so much to Abe, Lauren, and Kate, and of course Alice, who brought us all together today. I think some great insights were shared, and I think we all had fun in sharing advice with everyone.
And this is Sarah from Team Alice. I just want to thank everyone for just coming together to lead this great panel. Some amazing insights on monetizing, on strategy, on knowing your customer, and on really just thinking strategically. So I think this conversation could go on forever. We're always available to sort of field questions. Something that we will be doing after this panel today is sending just a quick feedback form, because we always like to hear from you on what is successful. And also, we've put a collection together on Alice specifically on monetization. So great sort of articles, tools, products, tips, and experts that are focused on sort of all of these practical, knowledge and tools. So feel free to reach out to us with any questions, but we'll be sending that out very soon. And just a final real big, huge, warm thank you to Lauren, Kate, Abe, and Meredith.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you guys so much. Have a good day.
It was a real pleasure interacting with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye.